For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mitchell Simoens. I'm a senior software engineer here at Sencha. Of course, there's my email and Twitter. If you have any questions, about anything, I have an open door. Go ahead, tweet me, email me, and I'll get you a reply. So today I wanted to talk about something I'm actually very passionate about, and it's the architecture of your Ext JS applications. One thing that I often see, and I visit with some customers, I talk to a lot of people, is they get a little too excited to start an application. They get contracted for work, they sign the deal and everything, and they're so excited just to jump into it. But today I wanted to talk about some best practices that hopefully you will implement there at the beginning level, to set yourself up for some success. So, of course, we all love Excited Jonah Hill. Like I said, you really got to, hold back a little bit from jumping into developing. So, pre-planning, before you jump into things, there's a lot of things that you really have to think about. When you get a feature list from your customer, your client, or your employer, that's really like a high-level overview of what your application is going to do. It's our jobs to actually implement that. And so we have to go a little low level and create a technical list of everything that we have to do. It's not just, hey, it's going to be an email application, so we need an address book. We need to be able to send an email. We actually have to break it down. And, what forms are we going to need? What overall UI, how do we actually implement that? And part of that is when you start breaking down your application, usually you get a design, you can start namespacing out your application. So you break things out into different features. So like that address book, that could be its own little namespace type of thing. Subclassing, I say don't be afraid to subclass. There is a little performance hit there, but overall, maintaining your application, breaking things down into little bits, subclassing can be a huge benefit for you. So don't have like some huge class that has 50 items inline in there. That's going to be crazy when you refactor things. So don't worry about subclassing. Today's JavaScript engines, they're pretty performant. You're really not going to feel that. One thing that I love about Ext JS 5 that we implemented is MVVM and view controllers. And I use those primarily through all my applications now. I really don't have a whole lot of global controllers. However, global controllers, we didn't strip those out now. We didn't throw that in the trash can. There's still a huge need for that. And I'm going to talk about that a little later. But the next thing, the last bullet point I have here is something that I am very passionate about. And I heard it from Ubisoft at the keynote. He said, if you're not using the router, you should. And that's exactly what I tell everybody. The router allows you to deep link into things. He said email link, and all of a sudden he has 100 new users using their app. I mean, that is just a huge and powerful thing that, planning that into your application up front is a lot easier than going back. I have to release in a week, okay, but we have to support the router. And so I always tell everybody, think about the router. We're going to talk a little bit about namespacing. So usually this is a screenshot from the new portal that I got from the designer. And so when I first look at it, okay, great. I see there's a form in there. That's great. But I stop myself. That's not the only thing that's there. There's the header. There's the center, the login. So as you can see now, I'm starting to break things down. And namespacing can follow that. There's the header namespace, the center, then you have a login namespace. So if you start breaking things down, that you're kind of like piecemealing your work now. So now you can separate things out. And so, like I said, you can start creating your namespaces. So the one thing that I will say is that you don't just have to, when you break down the design of it, you don't have to go primarily on that. You still have the feature list. So you have to think about the overall thing. And so the user login form, I namespace that out because throughout the application, I know there's going to be other user things. There's going to be like a settings form and stuff like that. And so I abstracted that to the user namespace, not center.user.whatever. So The namespaces, it helps to first go and break down that UI of it, but then after that, go and look at the rest of the application, see what you're really going to need. So to go to a little more complicated layout is the Sencha fiddle that is going to be released next week. And here it may be a little hard to see, especially in the back, but there's a lot of little colored boxes around things now. And now I'm really breaking things down into different little widgets almost. So the header has the title, it has the framework selector, and now a user dialog. So I'm breaking things down here. And I know it's can be a little time consuming to do all this, but as you go, it's going to help you to visualize things if you're working on a team, you can separate the different tasks on that now. And so, at my job, if I have people on my team, then now I can start assigning, hey, now you got to do this file tree, and that's your job. And so then that, of course, then bloats out the namespacing. And so as you see, there's things that are broken down into sections, some features, like the user namespace is now separated into a bunch of different things. Code reuse, there's always the mentality that smaller code is not always the best code. And that's true and that's not true. Smaller code, if done right, can be great. So creating an abstract class, so now you're going to share that amongst other classes. That's going to be huge and that's going to be powerful. And reusing code should be a high priority. You can make really things more declarative. Make things a config instead of having a method where you have to mix in a whole bunch of things. So it's a means of code reuse. You subclass and abstract like I do. So like a grid, like the sport portal has a lot of grids, but there's common UI elements. There's a search field at the top. The paging toolbar is in there. So I created an abstract. So now I don't have to keep implementing that. So it's an obvious way to really reuse the code and really for free. The plugins can be used if you need to add functionality to different classes. So maybe you need to add some feature to a text field, but also a grid or something. So that's where the plugin really shines, is where you can plug those in, and when you're creating an instance in the config object, you can really put those in there. So it doesn't have to be in the Ext.define. You can mix those in wherever you want. The mix-in, I actually was surprised. I was in Don's talk yesterday, and he asked, how many people use a mix-in, and a lot of people raised their hands, and I actually applaud that. I use mix-ins quite a bit, and they're like the plugin, but the plugin's more encapsulated away from the class, whereas the mix-in gets thrown right into the class. And so I use mix-ins quite a bit. The router that we have, I actually created a mix-in, so now I can add routes into any class, a view, controller obviously, but any custom class that I have now. So mix-ins, I thought nobody actually used it, and I was actually pleasantly surprised yesterday that a lot of people actually use that. I love it. And a singleton, so what I'm going to talk about is just a class, and you set singleton to true. So instead of a class definition there, that namespace is now that instance. There's only going to be one instance. That's great when you don't want your application to be too tightly coupled in that current state. And so if you abstract that logic out into a singleton or maybe a global controller, that's kind of, if you think about a global controller, it's kind of a singleton. You're only going to have one of those really. And so maintaining that piece, that chunk out of your views and whatnot can be very useful. If you refactor, we're all going to refactor the application several times during the development. It's a natural thing. So if you abstract that out in a way where, different pieces of your application can use that. And so I actually use it quite a bit myself. And command packages, it's really, all of the above. A command package can have all of those things. So you can have an abstract that you can plug into your package, where that package can now be used in different applications. So like the new portal, the new fiddle, they look the same. It's not just a theme package there. There's actually abstract classes. There's actually plugins and mixins within that package. And I can use that package and I can put it on some, we actually have an internal command repo. And now I can install those in any application I want. And that gives me a way to reuse that code. So now I'm starting not at the ground level now. Now I'm at the third floor type of thing. So the command packages can be very useful if you have multiple applications, if you have a workspace, multiple apps. One question I get is, should I use MVC or MVVM? And this question really, the world is not black and white. It's not either or. So when I get asked, should I use MVC and MVVM, I return a question, depends, what's your use case right now? I do prefer, the debate on which one to use is really an invalid debate in my opinion. I use them both. A view controller allows your view to be more of like a widget thing. You think local, so that view and that view controller are tightly bound to each other, and that's fine. But a global controller, their application may have global needs then. And so they still have their use case. So it's not either or. Go ahead and use an app controller if your application has some global use cases. I'll give you an example. The new Fiddle, I have the view controller that reacts to different user interactions. So if you click on the run button, it takes care of that. It listens to that. And then if you hit, I think it's Command Enter, it also runs it. So there's two different entry points to this. So what I do is that run, I elevate that to a global action. And now I need to go from the view controller, the local, the city, and bubble that up into the global, to the country, if you will. So if you start thinking local versus global and what your needs are in your application, you can really start to make your application not be tightly coupled to each other. The worst thing that I always see is people throw tons of logic in there. They're using app.getController to get that global controller and executing some method on it. Well, now you're tightly coupling your application. Sure, it works great, and that's fine. But down the line, you're going to refactor, and you're going to rename things. And now you have to go hunting around and renaming things. So instead of doing that, I fire an event on the view controller. And now any other controller can listen to that controller event domain. So the global controller can listen to any controller firing the did something event and do whatever that controller wants to do with that. You can also use global events, x.fireEvent, and then use the global event domain, or you can use x.on. So that's just two different ways, or kind of three different ways to go from that local up to that global. And that's something that, unfortunately, on the code reviews I do a lot of, they don't think about anything outside of that one use case. If you have to think of the whole application as a whole, but yet code, what you're only working on. So it's definitely a little skill that you have to learn to be able to traverse into these different realms that you can say. So now the router. Okay, so Ext JS 5, we released the router. And it's something that I have always been creating myself in my own applications, and Ext JS 3, 4, whatever. It's a common thing that you should be using. I study people using the internet a lot. My wife, I'm always looking at her on her laptop. How does she use Facebook? Well, she uses that back button quite a bit. And so if she's going to one of my applications, she's going to expect that back button to work. It's just a natural thing that's all ingrained in people's brains now. And of course, like I said before, you can email it, you can bookmark it, so you can deep link into a certain part of your application. And doing that up front is going to be so much easier to do than going back and refactoring things, because it sounds simple to, let's just support the router. It's not, if you want to do it properly. It's really not. I mean, people have to push back. I've seen people push back their launch date because they want to support it, but they never thought of it. So it sounds weird that I'm pretty passionate about the router, but I very much am. So I'd say don't undervalue these different aspects of it. Do not undervalue. I'm going to drill it to you guys. I mean, just do not undervalue it. Your users are going to thank you eventually. And one thing I say is become route-centric. And what I mean by that is if you click on a button and that button opens up a window or something, that is fine and dandy, but if you're going route-centric aspect of it, that button should just update the route, and then the router is going to see that and execute that route for that, and that's going to open up the window. And so that is definitely a mind shift that is hard for people to understand. Instead of doing it on the button controller, you're just going to expect it to happen sometime. But what that helps is when somebody's initially going into your application and hitting that route, the button clicking is not going to be there. So should you have that logic in that button handler, or should you have it in your route? Well, I say in your route because people are going to not have to follow into your app, click a button to get to wherever they want. You can just link right into where they want to go to. So so this is pretty much what I said. So instead of, on this case, it's double clicking on a grid, just use redirect to. And in your routes, then you can handle that, and you may want to make sure that that grid is in there. So you do have to do a little more work. So you're going to have to see if that grid's there. If it's not, then you're probably going to have to render that grid. Because you don't want something blank in the background of that window there. You want that grid to be there. Then detect if the ID was there, and if so, then we want to open up that window. So in this case, I have a condition on the ID URL parameter there to make that really optional. And there's going to be a little bit of logic in there to make sure that it's all numbers, it's all digits. So if you do user/ABC, this route's not going to know it. So that's a little bit of validation in there. And so I do say that it's kind of like async thinking. So you're going to fire an action, and then sometime the reaction to that is going to happen. So another thing that I use quite a bit, and this kind of builds off of that router talk, is to configure, not to config. So what I mean by that is using that config object when you define a class. And so if, like in that case, I was using a user route and an ID of that, so on my window class, I can have a user ID config on that. And so when it changes, I'm going to want to do an AJAX call, load the user details, maybe set that onto the form or something like that. For those that haven't used configs, the applier, you can kind of like sanitize it. Maybe you want to create an instance of something and return that instead. The updater is reacting to it, which in this case, I'm loading the user details. This really makes the class dynamic. The reason why I threw this in right after the router is when the hash and the URL bar can be changed at any point. So somebody could actually type in user/123, then later on change that to 456. So we have to handle that, but we don't want to close a window, open up a new window, or leave the old window in there. So the config here, what we can actually do is use the setter on it. And so we have that view, that window maybe is already open, so we can use the set user ID, and that'll trigger the updater and use that AJAX call and update everything automatically for you. But if not, then you still have to use the user form. You have to create the user form, I'm sorry. So overall, you have to think about coding your application if you're going to use the router, which I hope you do. You really have to think of it differently. You really have to take extra steps. But the benefit of it is huge. It's enormous. And I really want to employ you guys to start thinking about using the router. I really don't see a whole lot, when I do code reviews, I don't see a whole lot of people using the router, and I ask them why not. Because, well, they plan on doing it, but they didn't do it at the beginning like I've been saying. But there is a little bit of cost with configs. I want to be upfront and honest with you. We have to, Ext JS creates the getter, it creates the setter. There is a little performance cost. Instead of setting a property, now you're executing a function. There's going to be a little bit of a cost. But that thinking there of the cost and performance, wanting the best performance, is becoming legacy IE train of thought. If you're on Evergreen, the difference between setting a property, executing a function that will also set the property is really non-existent. Sure, you can JS perf me, and it's going to be 4 times slower or whatever. But I challenge you, show me an example. I think about not that performance number. I think about, can the user feel that performance change? And using a setter, I have not seen a single use, unless you're doing something crazy in the updater or whatnot. But I've not seen a use where that actually matters. The benefit of using configs, like I showed you, you can use the setter, the updater reacts to that, so now your class is much more dynamic. You don't have to close a window, open it up, or execute some function to do certain things. Your updater now takes care of that view. So all the logic is within that view. Everything else outside of that doesn't know it. All it has to do is use that setter, and the view will take care of everything. Before, if you don't use the config, you have to set the property, you have to execute a function, load the form maybe, use another function. So I want people to get away from tightly coupling these different classes. Think much more widget-like than what actually just works at the moment. And remember to clean up. So if you're setting, so a common use case that I do is I actually have configs for different components. So my abstract grid class has quite a bit of different configs. It has a config for the paging toolbar. It has a config for different buttons and stuff. And in the applier, I create an instance for all of those. It's just a config object, so ext.create, return that. And now I have that instance saved onto, have that instance saved onto the instance. Well, that can create a memory leak. Same thing with DOM nodes, anything really that's not just primitive, so objects, functions, stuff like that. So if you're using anything prior to 6.2, you are in charge of cleaning that up. If the framework doesn't clean it up, if you're using something, a custom config like we're talking about here, it's really on you. So if there's a memory leak in there, you have to clean it up. However, in 6.2, what we call the Reaper now, in the destruction phase, we actually go through and iterate through every property on that instance. And if it's an object or function, I think we delete it. We may nullify it, so don't quote me on that. But either way, we get rid of that memory leak for you. I still personally tend to clean up after myself. I don't want to rely always on the Reaper. It's going to stay around. However, I personally still want to take control of what I'm actually doing. I want to be a responsible programmer here. Maybe in the updater, I need to do something on clearing out the config. Maybe there's an instance that I created, but I didn't destroy that instance. And maybe I need to then destroy it in my own cleanup code. So you have to think about all these different things. So Ext JS applications are very complex. We have a lot of different things going on. We're a single page application most of the time. So you really have to think about what you're doing and what it means. Is it going to affect performance? Not too many things do these days. Thankfully IE6 is out of here. Now we're using Edge and more modern things, so we really don't have to worry about the smaller code. Are we doing everything uber efficient and everything like that. So the thought about architecture best practices is incredibly difficult to talk to, an audience as diverse as this right now. Your application is different than mine, so is yours, and so are yours. So best practices can only get you so far. I can only guess so much for you. I have my own experience that I can kind of have like little tips and tricks that I can tell you. But at the end of the day, you all have to learn maybe some different thought processes instead. We're different than other frameworks. We're very complex. And so I wanted to leave, we have about 20 minutes open for Q&A. I wanted to talk to you individually, to see what things that are hard for you to implement or to think about. So, one thing that I love to do is I love, just like Art yesterday in the keynote says he loves talking to customers, I love talking to developers. I love knowing what the bad points that, maybe we have missing documentation, we can improve the documentation. So in my sessions, I leave a lot of time, this is half the time, because I want to talk to all you all. And I want, if you ask a question and I get to answer you, then I want everybody to hear about it. Because now maybe, somebody in the back then may be able to, what, that's true. I never thought about that. And we have, 100 people here or so. I'm sure there's things that you guys are going to ask me that other people haven't thought about. So I want to open it up right now. And you had a question?
I don't have a solution for it, but it's just something to think about. A lot of times I find myself, the API documentation is great, but a lot of times I find myself just scrolling through all of the properties just to find something that I want to do. Maybe sorting of the best practices at the top or something like that. I always scroll for the entire page just to look for something that I may be using.
So the comment is in the docs, since we have a large API, we have tons of configs, tons of methods, how do you really find what you're looking for? And so there are commonly used configs, commonly used methods. So what you want is in the class body at the top, pretty much us pointing out, more examples maybe to show how to use certain things. Is that what you're wanting? Okay.
You have examples for everything mostly, but it's just something very general, just the creation or something like that, and one or two configs, but maybe some more examples.
Sure, more examples, that's definitely not an undervalued thing in our company. And so there's a trade-off there. So there's the beginner person that really needs, that small little code snippet. And then we need to have more intermediate and more advanced topics. And I can tell you that we actually have 2 people on a documentation team. So we actually have dedicated documentation team. And one thing that they are going for is using Fiddle more, so you can search for different examples, and creating better examples. So like the login app, we have a tutorial for that. We need more of those different step through things. I will agree with that.
But if you're looking in the class, you're looking at the help system, and you don't want to have to go jump to that fiddle unless you have a link there already. Perhaps if you had a checkbox to indicate that you're intermediate or advanced user, you'd love to be able to just look through examples right within the help.
Definitely, all those.
If you have links to Fiddle, fine, that's great.
Sure, yeah, all those integrations that we have. We know that documentation can be limiting, and we know that documentation is never going to be perfect. And so having more examples, of course, is never going to be a bad thing. And so having a way to show that, yeah, this is beginner, this is intermediate, a flag like that or something, maybe you can hide all the, okay. So yeah, exactly. So that's actually great feedback that I can pass back to that team. So you had your end up first.
Yeah, we're working on like a modern app that's actually more of a web view app on the native platform, so it's not compiled down in Cordova. And we went with the navigation view, and then at some point we were like, well, if we want to do routes and try to support the browser back button when people run on the desktop or whatever.
Sure.
Then we're having to fight the navigation view because it's got a back button, and we want to work on like if you're on a native on say Apple. iPhone or something, a back button they're kind of familiar with, but Android has got a different back button that's more browser kind of back button.
So the question is how to use routes with the navigation view pretty much on Modern Toolkit. And what you do then is when the route updates, so when the route executes, so you're reacting on that. And then like if there's an ID in there or what the whole structure is. And so you have to, in your route handler, you have to then find that navigation view, and you have to determine do you have to push a new view? Do you have to then go back if it's already in that stack? So you have to inspect the navigation view, see what's already in there, in order to go back or what, because at that point you don't know if the navigation view is populated with stuff. You just know that a route updated. So you have to then inspect that navigation view to see if there's an item in there that matches whatever the hash was then. There's really no baked in, a hash is to this item, and so XJS automatically handles that. There is no baked in solution there for you.
The navigation view stack. So now your back doesn't even make sense anymore. So
right.
It's like a big challenge for us as far as routes. We ended up just like scrapping that idea for now.
So yeah, his comment was, so if you're going from one app to another app and you hit back to go back to that other app, the state of that application is just blown away. And now Modern Toolkit, we don't have a concept of statefulness like we do in Classic. That's something that the API difference that we're working on to close the gap there. So you could save that into like local storage. I wouldn't do it in cookies because that'll just make all your requests huge. So you could save the state as you go into local storage so that when you hit go back, you can restore that state. Now you would still have to inspect what the hash is to see, maybe this is a back or maybe this is just somebody clicking on a link somewhere to go into there. And you would still have to build logic into your own statefulness to see how to handle that. Should you just start fresh or do you want to restore that? You had a comment on that?
No.
Okay.
Is there a way to, when working with routes, to know the back versus the forward? Because that drives...
Unfortunately, the browser, for the hashes, you really don't know if it's back or forward. Like, when the history change event happens, you have no clue at that point. So you have to build logic into your route handler to know what current state your application is in and where does the hash tell you where you have to go. So that's part of the mindset change that I was talking about, is now you do have to do a little more work, but the payoff is still much greater. So it still enables you to do a lot more. Yes?
Yes, you talked a lot about relationship between controller and view controller, but you didn't touch model versus view model. It's my understanding that binding is really associated with view model, but we have a lot of use cases where we want to get the data from the server into a store, but that data can be shared in many different forms or many different grids, and we don't want to go and visit the server to get that data every time from each local copy. So we want to use like a central repository for the data, which means a model, not a view model, right?
So the question is, so going back to the MVC versus MVVM idea, it's the model versus view model. And they're really two different things. A model is just the class definition behind the record in a store. Whereas a view model is just kind of a data holder for the view that you can bind to. So it's really two different things.
So how do you share data between two views?
Just to comment on that, the model is more like a rigid schema, and the
Sure.
model is more like an augmented collection of fields, like a presentation for your data.
Sure.
So that has more flexibility than the model itself, because now you don't have to mess with like field definitions and all of that stuff.
Right. And so the view model, what's special about it is, say you have your main JS, like command generates, and you have the view model on that. Then you have some child that has a view model. So you can still have data on that top level view model, and you can still bind to that deep within your application. So the data is kind of like smashed together, and so you can still bind to it from different view models.
And if you were to change the store, like the central store,
Mm-hmm.
that would update the binding would take place, and it would update all the different forms with that new data.
Yes. Yes.
Part of it, nothing can be done there.
Right, yeah. That's the beauty of all that data merging, is that if something updates that top one, whatever it is, everything that is bound to that is going to automatically be updated for you.
How do you bind that view model into the model in the store?
It happens automatically. You don't have to do anything. So it automatically kind of like bubbles up. If this view model doesn't have that data that you're binding to, then it's going to go traverse up the item hierarchy, and ask each view model, hey, do you have this data? No, okay. Do you have this data? Okay, you do. Then let's use that. So you had your hand up quite a bit.
Routing. Say you have an application with different modules, views, and there's subviews and so on. What's your kind of best practice on the logic for handling the routing in terms of one, a main controller, and that main controlling, knowing all it needs to know to kind of go to the subview? Or do you kind of dispatch the routing so every module or view needs the routing logics in itself?
Sure. So the question is, how do you use routing in a kind of modular fashion? Certain view controllers may not be instantiated, for example, but they may have routes on it. The answer to that really isn't a perfect one in the current state of Ext JS. So if that view controller is not instantiated, it's not going to know about some route changed. So at this point, routes are really a global concept at this point. There is talk about changing that into having like the mix-in and having that built into the framework. You could, there's private classes. If you want to use private classes, there's other ways that you could do that. But as far as out of the box, there's really not a good way to do that to spread the routes out, unfortunately. Yes?
Can you a little bit more elaborate about the mixing router that you mentioned?
Sure. Right now, out of the box, routes cannot be mixed in. This is one change that we're looking at the next version of Ext JS. In fact, I have a pull request to make that. After this, if you'd like, I can provide you with an override that'll allow you to do that. But out of the box, it's only going to be available in either a controller or view controller. Yes?
I have both a comment and a question. We actually ran into the same thing with the routes where we have a module level routing, and then you go to a module and instantiates a lot of views, and then some of those views have different routes too that they have. One approach that we took was you can listen to before and after, basically, when you're doing the route, and you can, on the before, you can kind of create the view and then refire it. approaching them. I actually had the same question if there's something cleaner to do.
Okay.
But that's one approach that we use.
So before we go on, I just wanted to comment on that there. So what he was asking about is, so a route, you can have a handler, but you can also have a before handler. It's kind of like the applier on a config you can kind of think of. What he was saying that what he does is he creates, maybe he needs to create the user form in that before handler. And then, you resume the action and the form is already there for you. The problem I have with that, one, it's fine to do. If it works, it's fine. But the before is really meant to enable you to have more of security permissions.
Validation.
Right.
Which I don't like that approach either, but that's the only workaround we could come up with.
Sure.
As opposed to having everything at the global level.
Right.
And the question I had was, you mentioned it's good to break things out into classes, not have these monolith huge classes. And we went from 4 to 5, and we started using MVVM. We started creating all the view models, view controllers, and we're at about 2,200 classes right now. We have a huge single page app.
Sure.
On the development side, on the production side, it's fine. Sencha command nicely minifies it, builds it up, serves pretty quick. It's still a huge file, but that's not a big problem. Development though, loading 2,200 files in your browser, that takes
Sure thing.
seconds
Yep.
on very fast machines.
Right.
Is there, from what I heard, there's no module loading type of support
Correct.
in Ext JS. Is there any suggestions or anything coming in the future, or
So.
how do we scale this?
So the question is how do you scale local development when he has 2,200 classes? So like I say, don't be afraid to subclass. Well, that just bloats up the number of classes. So during development, you have to load all of those classes, and that's going to take a long time. Sure. Module loading isn't something that we support. With command, though, you could actually compile your own little JavaScript files. So you can target different namespaces. There's tags and whatnot. So you can build your own little modules and then just load those in. For development, though, doing that is really probably going to slow you down because you make a change. Well, now you're going to have to recompile, and that's going to slow you down. So unfortunately, since Ext.js applications are complex, they're big, it's really going to have to just be something that you're going to have to live with, unfortunately. There's not going to be a way to speed up loading 2,200 classes. Now you can optimize what you're requiring. So at app startup, you're not requiring everything. You're just, as you go, different classes are requiring other classes. And so, maybe it's down to, 1,500, but still it's going to take a little bit of time, unfortunately. It's the side effect of having a nice big old Ext JS app. A question back and back?
I used to, in the universal app, always create a model and then just turn right around and create the store. Now I find myself still creating the model, but then just defining the store in a new model. And I just wanted you to speak to the trade-offs and the differences.
Sure. So the question is about where to really define your stores. Should you define it in the view model? Should you do it on the application? I tend to still do it on the view. So on a grid, you store it equals an object type of whatever alias or X class. The one thing that I do like to do is on a grid, I often have a paging toolbar. So you have to have the same store instance on that. And by default, you have to get into an init component and set the store onto the paging toolbar. But with binding now, that just happens automatically for you. And in a view model, if you have a store, you can have a change store, where if you have some parent data structure, you can have a change store hook into that, and it creates a separate instance based on that, off that top level store. Now that's not specific to view model, but that's where I see most of it used is in a view model. So like I said before, the world is not either or. It's going to be dependent on what your current use case is. But there is going to be a performance hit of binding. There's a schedule behind that. And there's going to be a lot of code that executes to bind properly. And so if you don't need to bind, then don't bind it. Yes?
You mentioned cleaning up your configs. When exactly do you do that as far as best practices?
In the destroy function. So the question is, where do I do my cleanup of configs? And so I hook into the destroy function. You got the call parent, of course, but I do that right above the call parent. So if I have a config for grid, I do a this.set grid null, and that's how I do my cleanup there. But of course, with 6.2.0, it's going to just happen automatically for you. Yes.
Sencha offers a couple of naming technologies like namespaces, X types, component IDs, and I found that when I tried to exclusively use any of those, I always run into issues. And I was wondering which, in your opinion, what is the best practice for choosing a naming system for your application?
So the question is, how do I name things properly, really?
Like X types, for example, I'll run into name collisions for larger apps, or if I'm introducing third-party code that uses the same name for certain parts. For namespaces, that's brittle code, because if I move pieces around, then I have to change all the references.
Sure.
In component ID, that is scoped to the component itself, so anything underneath that will only have exposure to that name.
Right.
And every time I try to design an app using any of those, I'm always stuck.
So the favorite thing that I do is my X type really follows the namespace. So if I have myapp.view.user.form, my X type for that is myapp-user-form. So I take the view out there because it's an X type. It's just not needed. And so that way I'm scoping all my X types to my app. So if you have another package from some third-party person, you're not going to have those collisions because yours, unless I guess the package name is the same name as your app.
Yeah, we are using that same, but then we have problem with refactoring. When you're refactoring and then you move your class, then you have to remember to change the X type and then change everywhere where you have used it.
Yeah, I've run into the same thing.
Right,
Yeah.
right. That's a big problem for us, but we didn't find any better solution.
Yeah, so refactoring and what your names are currently, you're going to have to do a search and find all the instances, and the plugins that we have do have refactoring supports that may help you.
Yeah, but because X typing is not connected to the name of the class. That's the thing that you do and I and he.
Right.
So plugin has no idea how to change the X type. It doesn't leave it that way.
Sure.
But because if you want to follow your own convention, then after you refactor via plugin, then you have to go change the X type, then find all the X type where it was used, and then change that again.
Yeah, I don't really have a silver bullet solution to.
Yeah, no, it's just to say to the other that there is a problem with that approach.
Sure.
And just a side note, somebody mentioned a packaging. Somebody had a packaging question yesterday. They had a presentation on essentially now being open to third-party packaging systems like Nodes, NPM, and Webpack for a build process. So they're currently working on some sort of process to allow packaging to be a little easier than a conventional Sencha command. I just thought I had that.
Sure, yeah, it's at that stage, we're going to have to really see are X types really needed anymore, because you can use the X class and just use the class name, so you don't have two different names. So in that state, we're moving into a modular area where now you're going to use more of variable names and everything. And so we'll have to see what that actually means at that time. My thought is X types and aliases may not mean as much then, because you're importing, setting a variable to that now and using that in your application. So unfortunately, time is up on me. I wanted to thank you all for coming. If you have any other questions that I couldn't answer, I'm in the Sencha zone all day. So I look forward to seeing you all, and thank you for coming.